appreciate the humor of the song we sang right before we go into these stories here. Well, if not, oh well. So let's go ahead and get right into it. Last week we finished up the story of the Shunammite and her son being raised back to life. That concluded in verse 37 of 2 Kings chapter 4. So we are ready for the next story here. And we're going to break it up just a little bit. It's not very long. But I'm going to break it up into two sections. So first, if someone would read for us 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 38 and 39, please.
And Elisha returned to Gilgal, and there was a famine in the land. Now the sons of the prophets were sitting before him, and he said to his servant, "Put on the large pot and boil stew for the sons of the prophets." So one went out into the field to gather herbs, and found a wild vine, and gathered from it a lapful of wild gourds, and came and sliced them into the pot of stew, though they did not know what they were.
Okay. So here's kind of our setup for this story. I mean, it's not a very long story, so we won't spend a ton of time on this, but some interesting details. Elisha has gone back to where? Gilgal. Okay, so he's moving around again. Now he's in Gilgal, and he is with who? Sons of the prophets. Some translations will say a company of prophets. These are a group of righteous men that seem to do the Lord's work. We've seen this before. This is not some new kind of thing. We saw this most prolifically early in 2 Kings with the story of Elijah going up to heaven, and every step of the way, they enter a town and there's a company of prophets there, and they tell Elijah, "Hey," or they tell Elisha, "Do you know that Elijah is going to go away from you?" And he says, "Yeah." Like every step of the way, there was a company of prophets. So there are men out there, even in Israel, still doing this work, and we've talked about this before. So this is not really a new situation for them. So he's in Gilgal. He's with these company of prophets, or the sons of the prophets, depending on your translation. And Elisha asks for what? Yeah, he thought it was a soup day too. So he asked for a large pot, and he said, let's get some food going. And what's kind of the problem here with asking for that? What's the situation in the land? There's a famine. You're going to hear this come up a lot, like there's a famine or something going on with the land. We had, going back to Elijah again during the time of Ahab, there's that 3.5 years of famine. And we're going to keep seeing these famines go on, and food scarcity and problems with that is going to continue. I don't know if those things are necessarily related, like whatever stores they had were completely empty during that 3.5 years, and they got really desperate, and they're kind of just getting by a lot, it seems. I don't know. I can't exactly pinpoint how the agricultural industry is doing at this point in time. But there's very little food to be had right now, at least in Gilgal, because there's a famine. So one goes out to gather some herbs, and he finds a wild vine from which he harvests some gourds. And I didn't try to attempt to figure out what kind of plant this would have been from all the clues we get. If any of you are better at botany than I, go ahead and figure that out and let me know what it is. Because I don't really know what plant it is. They don't tell us. It says they don't even know what it is. So if they don't know, I don't know how I would do much better. But one of the things is typically if you are going to eat something, you usually know what you're eating, because if you don't know, that could be bad. And we always probably have like this story of like, who was the first person to try this food to figure out that it wasn't poisonous? And, how many times did they have to, guess and check to see what was good to eat and what was not, and how many people suffered because of that? That's a whole kind of thing on its own. I'm not going to get too much into that, but they don't know what this is. They're just kind of hoping that, this is somewhat edible and maybe a little bit of flavor. They don't really know what it is. So that's kind of our setup. Any comments on verse 38, 39? Okay, let's continue on. Somebody read verses 40 and 41, please.
bring some flour, and he put it in the pot and said, serve it to the people that they may eat. And there was nothing harmful in the pot.
Okay. This is probably my favorite section of verses in the whole entire Bible. The phrase there is death in the pot. I love that. That's kind of my own thing. So they as they're eating, they say this, there's death in the pot, indicating that there's something bad about it. And I don't think it's just like the flavor is not good, like it just doesn't taste good. I don't think this is hyperbole here, that they're just so mad about how bad it tastes, because there's a famine, you're lucky to have anything. Because verse 41, the very end indicates that, once Elisha does this thing, there's nothing harmful in it anymore. So it was probably poisonous to some degree or had some sort of toxin in it. There's something really wrong with it that they can't eat it. It's not that it just doesn't taste good, because I could see that as being like, these guys are just really picky. I don't think that's the problem here. I think there is some sort of toxin or poison that they're identifying as they're eating it. So they can't eat it. There's death in the pot here. And just maybe another fun aside, you've probably like gone through the like Hobby Lobby and stores like that, and they've got little like inspirational signs, and a good one to put in your kitchen might be Proverbs 15:17. But this one might be good too. Maybe you could have it on the other end of the sign. Just a fun idea for anyone who's crafty on that. So there's some issue here. Probably something that's poisonous, something like that. And Elisha takes some flour, he puts it in the pot, and then there's no longer anything wrong with it. Now, we've kind of talked about, I'm thinking especially back to one of his earlier miracles where he restores the waters of Jericho by putting some salt into it. And there is some, chemical stuff that does help purify water if it's, mucky and diluted and, needs to get cleared up. Salt would help that. But the amount that he puts in would probably not have done that much and would not have done it for all of time, as it indicates in that section of verses. And I think we have a similar thing here. There's perhaps maybe the flour would have helped, but there's obviously something miraculous here. I've never heard of flour making something not poisonous before. I don't know. I don't know the chemical makeup of that enough, and we don't even know what this vine or gourd is. So anyone's guess, but I think something miraculous has happened here so that they can eat. The prophets, again, these are men who probably don't have a lot to live off of. We've kind of talked about this before, but they're going to have something to eat. God is going to make sure that they're going to be fed, they're not going to starve, and no one's going to die from eating this death in the pot. So it's a great little story. There's not really much else to it. Any comments, thoughts on this little moment here? Yeah.
But, and there are a lot of things like that. But it just reminds us that we need to be careful to be who we are always, and to make that a determined thing.
Yeah, and I think I could probably maybe answer, if someone had that question of why is this story of all stories in here? Like, why does this matter? It doesn't seem to have really any effect. He goes to Gilgal, he wants some food. The food's poisonous. He makes it not poisonous in a story. Like, what is the point of that? I think really what we need to consider is the larger context of what Elisha is doing here. Remember, Israel is a land that is largely unfaithful to God at this point. I mean, the kings have pretty much always been bad since Jeroboam. And then you had the worst of the worst with Ahab not that long ago. And you have still a son of Ahab on the throne here. And Elisha is still doing the work. You remember, if you remember 1 Kings chapter 19, when Elijah says to God, this is it. Let me die. My work is, it's fruitless. It's done. There's no reason for me to go on. Let me die. And God says, no, I have some things for you to do. One of those is to go get Elisha. Bring him along with you. And Elisha, he succeeds in Elijah's work, and he's still doing work. There is still things to do here, whether that's taking care of people who are faithful to God, whether that's helping to convince people that the Lord is still around. He hasn't abandoned them. Addressing the king when things come up and making sure people aren't suffering because one guy has made a really bad decision. There's going to be a lot of things that Elisha does that is very one-on-one, very personal. And we've gone through a lot of those stories already. And I think that is to remind us today of the nature of God. He's not just here to do the big things. He's here to do the things for one person, one small thing. For one small person, God cares about that too. God is not only interested with the big lofty things and my problem over here is not significant enough to get God involved. I'm not going to bother God about this. God wants you to bother him about that. If it bothers us, we should go to him about it. We should not think that it's not important enough for God. So there is a larger, I think, maybe description of God's nature to us in stories like this. And we get them again and again and again to kind of hit home that point that God is not just going to abandon people if they're willing to come to him. We have several examples of that here just with Elisha, and we see in other places too, but certainly I think this could be an example of that. Any other comments on this story here? It's a fun story. I love the expression "death in the pot." I'm sure if I ever said that about my mother's cooking, I'd get killed, but be very careful where you use this. All right, very good. Let's continue on to the last part of this chapter. That's another short story for us. Someone read 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 42 through 44, please.
Then a man came from Shalisha and brought the man of God bread of the first fruits, 20 loaves of barley bread, and newly ripened grain in his knapsack. And he said, "Give it to the people that they may eat." And the servant said, "What, shall I set this before 100 men?" And he said again, "Give it to the people that they may eat, for thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left over." So he set it before them, and they ate and had some left over according to the word of the Lord.
Okay, so again, another very short story, but I actually have a few interesting thoughts about this. So we have this man that comes from Baal Shalisha, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Now, the location of this is not exactly certain. They believe this is somewhere near Gilgal. So, if Elisha's already in the area, that would kind of make sense. I think this may be a story that's very soon after, if he's still in the area there. And he comes with, I believe it's 20 loaves of barley bread. And Elisha tells him, give it out to the people to eat. And he responds that, this food is not enough to feed 100 men. There's no way. But Elisha tells him, give it to him anyway, and there's going to be some left over. And, lo and behold, that's what happens. They feed the people. They're full. There's some left over. Now, all that in itself, again, this could be like another little story like the one we just read of the death in the pot. But I think there's something even more interesting here. Consider that, he's got 20 loaves of bread. He says, this is not going to feed 100 people, but lo and behold, it does, and there's some left over. This should sound very familiar for those who remember in the New Testament. You have in a couple of I think actually all the Gospels mention the feeding of the 5,000. Details are a little different, but you have how many loaves of bread in that instance? 5 and 2 fishes, which I don't know the size of the fish. We're not exactly told, but to me that seems a little bit less than 20 loaves of bread. That seems like 20 loaves of bread would be a bit more, at least in mass consumption, caloric intake. I don't know, whatever metric you want to use. But interestingly here in 2 Kings chapter 4, those 20 loaves feed 100 men, which is miraculous. Like, that is amazing in itself. But when you compare that to what Jesus does with 5 loaves and 2 fishes in the New Testament, feeding 5,000 people, like, how do you look at that and say, well, that's not very impressive? And they had, 12 basketfuls of bread left over? That is amazing. So I wonder, and, we can always wonder about some things, if there's another reason for this story aside from, kind of the things I mentioned with the death in the pot story, if this is here to provide context for what Jesus does later on. I can imagine the Jewish people who were there, who were fed, people who heard the story, heard what had happened, say like, hey, didn't that happen? Didn't Elisha do something like that? And then they hear the numbers like, oh, this is so much greater than what Elisha did. Not to hit on the Hebrews study too much, but here's the superiority of Christ in action, right in front of you. And you can do the numbers, you can run it however you want, but no prophet had ever done anything at this magnitude like this. So, I think that may be an interesting kind of, bar maybe for Jesus to just completely supersede, for the people to understand, what Jesus was doing was a really big deal. Something like this had happened before, but not, to the degree that had ever happened before. So I think that's a really interesting detail. I mean, we don't have to play comparison for it to be a very interesting story, but I think that definitely adds a whole nother layer to it. So that's really all I have to say about this. I think that's just really an interesting thought. Any comments, thoughts about these few verses here at the end of the chapter? Go ahead, Jeff.
The miracles that Jesus worked in his ministry they were like metaphors in several ways. So when he healed in John chapter 11, no, 9, when he gave sight to the blind man, he said, I am the light of the world. And there's a message behind the miracle.
Mm-hmm.
So Jesus speaks of 5,000, he says, I'm the bread of life. So what these miracles are teaching us is that God has power in all the areas we need him to have power. He can help provide for the things that we need is what this type miracle will help us to remember, even when it seems impossible to us. And it doesn't matter whether it's a little impossible or a lot impossible, as you talked about.
Right.
It's still a miracle.
Right.
So this is as much a miracle as Jesus, because there's no quantity with God. If he can do something, he can do it in whatever quantity he chooses to do. He has limitless power. So what types of things can God do? God can calm the storm, protect us. So, these miracles help us, and I think these two miracles show those two things. God can provide for us and God can protect us. And so, and there are many other type lessons that we learn from the miracles, but we need to be sure and see the deeper lesson in these miracles and remember that when we get in some type of quandary ourselves.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, either way you look at it, it's miraculous. And, I don't want to get off the study too much because Jesus' miracles is a whole other great story. But, we have instances where people say things like, no one talks like he talks. He speaks with authority. Every time he's doing something for somebody miraculous, some sort of sign, there is something else with it. The teaching or some comment that he makes that makes the people think like, maybe we need to consider our service to God in a different way, or, maybe he's trying to, show that the Pharisees and the hypocrisy is not going to work out. There's always something that goes with that. And we don't see as much, teaching or lessons in these instances, but because no one had been doing miracles like we see in the Old Testament in that time until, Jesus is on the scene, they recognize, this is a man of God. We can't deny what has happened here. It's clearly evident to all. And, that was one of the things that drew people's attention. Now, they didn't always accept the teaching. That was the harder part. But at least the miracles, they got people's attention. Anyone who knew the Old Testament history would say, this is definitely a sign from God. maybe we needed to listen to this, even if the teaching was very difficult for them. Very good. Any other comments on chapter 4 here before we move on to chapter 5? Okay, let's move on to chapter 5. We will definitely not finish chapter 5. Chapter 5 is a bit lengthy. There's a lot of interesting details we will be talking about, so we'll at least start. But with the last 15 minutes we have, I don't think we'll get through all of it. Someone begin by reading 2 Kings chapter 5, just verse 1, please. Just verse 1. Okay. So I think probably all of you know the pattern by this point. If I say I want to read one verse, it means I have a lot to say about that one verse. Sorry. We're introduced to a new character here, if you will. His name is Naaman, and he is a military man. He is a commander of the armies of what nation? Syria. Or your translations might use Aram. My translation uses Aram. That's the term I'll use. So if your translation says Syria, we're talking about the same place. But I'm using Aram because it's just what I have in my text. I got to put one or the other. Now, what do we know about Aram or Syria? What's its relationship in the grand scheme of what the political situation is here as it relates to Israel?
That's where a lot of terrorism comes from.
Well, I'm talking about in this time.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know.
Syria bordered the northern, it was on the northern border of Israel.
Okay, so it was a neighbor of Israel, and do they have a good, happy relationship at this point? No. In fact, probably the quite opposite. They're kind of mortal enemies at this point in time. You remember back in 1 Kings, who was Ahab always fighting against? Syria or Aram. I'm going to say Aram. That's the word I'm going to use. Ben-Hadad was the king. He had all these battles. Ahab had a couple successes because the Lord delivered him into his hands. But also, Ahab died in battle against the Arameans. So, the people of Aram are pretty much enemies with Israel. There's been fights before. There's going to be more fights to come. There's going to be plenty of fighting with Aram. They're really kind of the main enemy of Israel in this time period. So, we think a lot of times the enemies of Israel, we think of the Philistines probably is the first one we think of during the time of Saul and David. But in this point in time in Israel, at least in the northern kingdom, Aram is the prime enemy that they have. So just keep this in mind. This is not a Jew. This is not anyone of Hebrew descent. He's not a descendant of Abraham. He's the enemy, if you will. He is an enemy, and he's a commander of the army. So he's not just some grunt who happens to be on the other side of the border. He is a big man. He's in charge of a lot of things. And it says about him, we get some characteristics described about Naaman. Aside from him being a great soldier and a leader, the king of Aram holds him in high regard. And I believe at this time it's still Ben-Hadad who is king of Aram. So I believe the same Ben-Hadad that was king during the wars with Ahab back in 1 Kings, if you remember those battles. I think it's the same king of Aram here who would be Ben-Hadad. It's not, his name isn't mentioned here, but it gets mentioned later. So I believe it's the same guy. I think what's another interesting thing here is that the credit that Naaman's victories are they're given to God. God gave him those victories. It's not that Naaman was the smartest, the most intelligent, he was tactical or had great strategy. God gave him the victories, is what these scriptures say. And sometimes we wonder about this. Well, why is God helping the enemy? Why is he helping these non-Jews in their military campaigns? Why would he do this? And I think when we get into that mindset, we really narrow the scope of God in a way that God does not work. God does not look at one nation, and we think of Israel all the time and say, like, this is the people, I'm only going to help them. Everybody else, you're on your own. go ahead and figure it out. Forget about you guys. That is not how God operates. And I think the reason we get into that trap sometimes is because most of the Old Testament is focused on the Israelites. That's just how the narrative is written for us. I don't think we should take that and say, well, God doesn't care about anybody else. In fact, here's an example of the opposite. God is helping Naaman. Now, I don't think this is because Naaman is necessarily a righteous man, at least not yet. We'll talk about that in his condition as far as his service to God later. But we'll see later that he at least admits to Elisha that he had offered sacrifices and burnt offerings to other gods. So he may know something about the God of Israel at this point. We're not really clear on that. But he certainly has a pantheon of other gods that he has done service for. I don't think he's necessarily a righteous man at this point. And so we would ask, well, if he's not a Jew, he's not a righteous man, why is God helping this person? I think he is a man who is in a bigger narrative. And we see this all the time. Ahab even had this opportunity where God gave Ahab victories to show Ahab that God was in charge, even though Ahab had no business winning those battles. He did because God delivered it into his hands. Now, Ahab squanders that. He never figures it out. He decides he's not really interested in serving God, even after God does that for him, and we see what happens to him. And I've kind of made this comparison before. The flip side of that is a person like Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, who is not a God-fearing man. He has his own huge ego. That's what happens, I guess, when you're over an empire. But over time, as he has his encounters with Daniel and how God works through Daniel, he sees that the God of Israel, he is the God, he is the God Almighty, and he says that. He proclaims it that way. He figures it out. So when we think, why is God helping a non-righteous person? There's probably something bigger at work here. Either this person is going to come to a point where they learn about God, or understand God in a fuller way, or they're going to cause someone else to come to God in some way. God works in ways that we don't always understand, and Habakkuk is a great example of that. If you ever go back and read Habakkuk, it's not very long. He says, God, why are you going to punish our country with this even worse nation that has no regard for you? And God says, I have a plan here. You just don't understand it yet. And I don't think Habakkuk did understand it in his time, but we see how it plays out later on in history. So we need to, sometimes we judge God or scold God for why is he helping these unrighteous people? God has something bigger at play that we just may not understand in that particular moment. So just kind of an aside on that. I don't think Naaman, at least at this point, is a righteous man, but God is using him and working through him in his military campaigns. One other thing we want to mention is, even though he is a man of high esteem, he's a great military leader, he has a problem. And what is his problem? He's got leprosy. Now, I want to talk just a little bit about this. We don't really know a lot about his specific condition because I don't know how much we want to get into the medical issue of this, but leprosy can be, a spot, it can be just an area, or it can be, it's all over your body. There's different severities, I guess, of the affliction that you can have. We're not told directly, I guess, how bad it is or how long he's had this leprosy. Whether this is something he's had for a long time, several years, or, maybe it's recently something that's developed and now, he's worried about it. In verse 11, when we get to there, when he talks about, being healed, he talks about, maybe the man of God, striking the spot or putting his hand over the spot or the place or the area, which would mean to think, that would tell me that maybe it's in one area, maybe it's on his back or his arm or something like that, or his leg, not necessarily over his body. But then, of course, we have later verse 14 where it talks about when his skin is restored, it doesn't limit it to one area. It's his whole body. Now, that may be because it healed the leprosy in one spot and anything else on his skin in other places. It's not really clear. I'm just going to put that out there. We don't really know how bad it is. I tend to think maybe it's just an area, one spot, not necessarily his whole body, but we don't really know for sure. I don't think we get clarity on that enough to say one way or the other. But the problem is, if you've got leprosy, what can you not really do? you can't really be among other people. Now, the old law had a lot of rules and restrictions about those with leprosy. Are the people of Aram under that law? No, but they had probably figured out that if you have leprosy and you're around other people, it's going to cause problems. I'm sure they figured that out. So if you've got leprosy and you're in this great high position, you're not going to be able to work as well. You're not going to have as much success. You may find yourself in an early retirement, exiled, and away from everything that you love just because you can't do what you were able to do before. And again, we don't know the severity of it at this point. We're not told how long he's had it. And I don't want to do too much guesswork. I don't think it really matters for the purpose of the story, but it is a problem that he has and something that he would definitely like to not be a problem. Any thoughts about Naaman himself just on verse 1? I think I've kind of covered most of the gambit.
We need to be real careful, and you touched on this earlier in your comments about we need to be real careful about judging how God's word applies to other people. Now, there are certain circumstances in which that can be done, and it would be a denial of the truth to do otherwise.
Mm.
We have to be careful about how far we take that. So in Naaman's case, we need to recognize that God in ancient times overlooked idolatry among Gentiles, not among the Israelites. They should have known better. But the Gentiles had no law, no written law. And so it may be that a person's going to an idolatrous temple, following the rules that the priest at that temple gives him, and he is made righteous by, Romans chapter 3, verse 15, 14, 15, 16 talk about this. Because as they do the word of God, though they haven't received the word of God through kindness, through loving others as you love yourself, and all those other things, the things that are self-evident that God's word teaches. Gentiles did that, and as they did that and followed their conscience, it seems to be, that they were declared to be righteous. And by the blood of Jesus, all righteousness comes by the blood of Christ. But Naaman could be righteous. We don't know about his condition. He does seem to need a lesson in humility, but he is a very, very important person.
Yeah.
He is the chief commander of all the army, and he is the right-hand man for the king. When the king goes to the temple to worship, Naaman is at his side to help him and lending a little more credence that this has been Hadad. He's an old man now. He's been around a long time, so I think it does make sense that this probably is nearing the end of the time.
Yeah, we'll see his end. Yeah.
But in any case, we just have to be careful. It doesn't mean that we can encourage people in their sin. No, never. Anything contrary to God's word, we can never encourage. We just have to be careful as we apply God's word to people who have never had a chance to hear, who have never received the gospel in any meaningful way. God will take care of that. And nobody will accidentally make it to heaven, and nobody will accidentally be cast into hell. It'll all be according to God's plan. And we have to continue to set a good example to teach people so they may come to know God. And yes, people do have to come to know God to be saved in some way. And but we need to recognize that God teaches people in different ways, not just through the word. That is the most important way that God teaches. But he teaches through creation, through the universe, through the example of other people. And so we just have to be careful about how we judge other people and to what degree we judge other people.
Yeah, and I don't think I would go as far to say that Naaman, I wouldn't say he was a righteous man necessarily, because he did offer sacrifices to other gods, and we could say, well, maybe he was in ignorance, and perhaps there was some ignorance there, but being a border nation, Israel, I'm sure he had heard about the Lord of Israel. There have been stories throughout the ages. You can look at a lot of the non-Israelite nations that were either around during the time or shortly after the destruction of the kingdoms. They knew something about God. We had our Abraham study. When he goes down to Egypt, the Pharaoh of Egypt there understands something about God and something about what he expects from him. and he has respect for that. So they may not serve God in the way they're supposed to, or they may not hold him as high regard as they should, or maybe he's not the forefront of their mind. But oftentimes they know something. There's some understanding of there is a God who is over everything. And I think Paul in Athens is somewhat of an example of that. A lot of the people come to him and they ask questions and they want to know more about what he's teaching. And that's a great story because he doesn't quote from the Old Testament. He doesn't get Old Testament examples. He starts from what they know, and that's very little. But he's able to teach them about the understanding of God, of which they know very little about. And we have stories like Jonah going to Nineveh, another great, powerful city, not a righteous city, full of great wickedness, but God is concerned about that city. That is the lesson of Jonah is they're not Israelites, but God is concerned with them as well, no matter who they are, where they're from. But God expects them to act in a certain way. There's not, you're ignorant, you don't know anything, you get a free pass. God expects something from them. And we cannot be the judge necessarily of what that is because we don't know exactly all what goes into that, what they were doing with all detail. We're not qualified to judge that. I'm actually glad we don't have to because we can let God be judge of that. But we know what he expects of us. And when we know what God asks for, we do that. We don't have that ignorance. So we should not try to go back to that by any means. Any other comments on verse 1? I thought I'd get farther than that, but our time is almost up here. So I'm actually going to stop there. I was thinking we'd get a little bit farther, but that's as far as we're going to get. So next week we will move on through chapter 5. We may finish chapter 5. It is long, but we may finish it next week. We'll go through chapter 5 for sure next week, whether we finish it or not. If you've already gone ahead and read chapter 5, I encourage you to go ahead and maybe read chapter 6 as well, because we're going to see a lot more things that Elisha does. But chapter 5 is a really interesting chapter, so if it takes us next week and maybe a little bit of the week after, that's okay. I think there's a lot of good discussion we can have about this chapter. I mean, it took us 15 minutes just to get through verse 1, so that's mostly my fault. I understand that, but we have a lot of things that we can probably glean from this story because there's a lot of character interaction. We have Naaman, we have a servant girl we're going to be introduced to in the next few verses. We're going to have Elisha. We're going to have the king of Israel, the king of Aram. We're going to have Gehazi come back, Elisha's servant, as part of the story. There's a lot of interesting character interactions here, and I think they all kind of deserve their own recognition and deep dive and to see kind of how they all work in God's plan here. So we'll start, I guess we'll kind of sort of restart chapter 5 next week. At least we'll know who Naaman is, and we'll start in verse 2 and go on. Thank you.